Right then, so this is the Meridian 22 work group. This is technically the first call of the work group. We had a pre-starting call a while back, and we officially launched the work group about a month ago. The idea of Meridian 22 is to bring people together from the top of Europe downwards. So we've got everyone dialing in from places as far as Finland and Greece. And the idea then is to try to encourage these communities to contribute more to the global community and build some bridges. There's terrific work going on in the Meridian 22 area, and we want to make sure that people are fully informed of it. We also want to make sure that people outside of Meridian 22 can lend a hand where useful. Now, this meeting is an OpenChain meeting, and that means it's a Linux Foundation meeting. So it's under the Linux Foundation antitrust policy. You'll find the full policy on the Linux Foundation website. Any questions? If you're from a member company, you can speak with Andrew Updegrove, who's the lawyer on the LF side for this. If you're not from an LF member company, you can talk to your own counsel. But the long story short, the antitrust policy helps us all talk in a way that makes everyone comfortable. Right, today is a simple agenda. We have two things on the agenda. One is to have Kieran O'Riordan from Eclipse Foundation giving us a briefing on, well, there's a ton of regulation coming out of the EU, and he's going to talk through some of that. And then we're going to have Vlad talk about some of the regulation happening in Bulgaria. So Vladimir is going to talk about what we're seeing in that market space. And as some of you who dialed in early will have heard, we're going to call on Evo as well to join in on that. Speaking of which, this is a community call, which means that everyone everywhere can jump in at any time. Don't hesitate to not only ask questions, but to share ideas, to tell people about what's going on in your country, to essentially connect. Our whole goal with this community is to keep things informal and useful. Right then, we have quite a few people on the line, including some guests outside of Meridian. I see Gary Armstrong is here from FOSS ID. Hey, Gary. And Martin Yagi from First Light Fusion, chair of our education work group as well. And Zenhua San from ByteDance. So we're being represented not only across Europe, we're also seeing some participants from Asia, apart from myself. Excellent. Well, I know that everyone's here to see Kieran and to listen to Vladimir. So I'm going to hand over. Vladimir is in charge as one of the people running Meridian 22. But our first speaker up is Kieran. Kieran, over to you to let us know a little bit more about this stuff and to give everyone a chance to ask questions.
Okay, so you can see my screen and you can hear me and everything is great. So the the thing that has gotten everyone talking is the CRA. But of course, the CRA is only one of the many pieces of legislation that we're currently working on. Uh, I will, however, start with the CRA because the CRA itself is a lot more complex than is sometimes reported in the media. So the CRA was proposed in 2022 and then adopted in 2024. And sometimes the media covers it as if that is the end of the legislative phase and now we have to deal with it. In previous legislation, that was often the case, but the Parliament and Commission have taken a different approach in the last cycle, possibly because the last cycle was compressed due to time being lost on the pandemic. But the regulations from the previous 5 years, a lot of the time they have been completed in 2024, but they've left a lot of details over to be defined then by other instruments after the legislation is completed. So we always have the implementation work to develop compliance procedures whenever there is new regulation. And that's also the case with the Cyber Resilience Act. But at the same time, we are also working on many of these implementation details, which for other regulations are usually small details, but for the Cyber Resilience Act, they're very large, very consequential details. So for the Cyber Resilience Act, we have four main categories, I think, of what I call post-legislative instruments. As the logical thing to call them would be like implementing acts, but there is something else called implementing acts. So I'll call them post-legislative instruments. And so there are standards being written to define a good way to comply with the 44 obligations of the Cyber Resilience Act. And so what the standards do is they give you a detailed description of how to comply with an obligation. For example, the very first obligation in the annexes of the Cyber Resilience Act is that you cannot publish software, or you can only publish software if it has no known exploitable security vulnerabilities. Now, there's many words in that sentence that are difficult to interpret in a legal sense. How do you know that you've fulfilled your obligations? And that sentence is also subject to a previous sentence which says subject to a risk assessment. And so then another question is raised of what is the relationship between the risk assessment and the obligation, and can the results of the risk assessment soften the obligation? So the one way to comply with the Cyber Resilience Act is then to open up the Cyber Resilience Act and read these obligations and develop your own procedure, and then tell all your users that you are quite confident that your procedure is compliant with the Cyber Resilience Act. But there's a second mechanism, which is that the Cyber Resilience Act requires the Commission to have standards drafted for each of these individual obligations. And then once the standards are drafted by an approved EU standardization organization, they will be sent to the Commission for then approval of the finished version. And so this will give some kind of official character to that procedure for complying with the obligation. And the Cyber Resilience Act has a clause saying that if you follow the standard, you get a legal presumption that you are in compliance with the Cyber Resilience Act. So this gives you the legal presumption, and it's also rubber stamped by the European Commission. And so it makes it a lot stronger, or a lot more useful for your users and customers in terms of proving that you are in compliance with the Cyber Resilience Act. So there are 44 of these standards being written, and we're doing our best to participate in those procedures, which I'll come back to a little later. The second category of post-legislative instruments is the voluntary attestation program. And so this is for smaller entities which do not have any obligations under the Cyber Resilience Act. If they wish to provide a security attestation, they can do this, and the voluntary attestation program will provide a framework that will allow them to do that in a standardized way. And the purpose would be to help the people who do have obligations in their performance of due diligence. So the Cyber Resilience Act has very little detail on what exactly will be in the voluntary attestation program, and the balancing act is going to be difficult to try to make something that is, on one hand, complete, so that it gives people confidence that due diligence is done, but at the same time it has to be lightweight, because this is an obligation that will be given to people who don't have any, or sorry, this is a request more so, that will be given to people who don't have any obligations. And so if you give them something very difficult to complete, then they're going to say, well, why would I do that? So the voluntary attestation program is still to be defined. The third thing then is delegated acts. And so these are for details such as defining certain product categories. And so the Cyber Resilience Act has certain special categories that have extra obligations and also have extra documentation, and such as, for example, operating systems. And so then they have to answer the question of what is an operating system, which of course has never been a simple question to answer, and has been discussed for decades and decades. But we're working on a delegated act to define the terms such as this. And then the fourth category of post-legislative instruments would be the guidance documents. And so the Commission can produce any number of guidance documents, but the Cyber Resilience Act asks them to produce certain documents, and one of them is specifically for free and open source software. So we're working with the Commission, and we're working with a lot of stakeholders in the free and open source ecosystem to try and figure out what aspects of the Cyber Resilience Act need guidance from the European Commission, and then what answers can the European Commission give to the questions that the ecosystem has. So these two aspects, the post-legislative work and the compliance work, they have to be looked at together because they are both feeding into each other. The people who are trying to work on compliance procedures can't do that until we have definitions or final versions of all these other substantive pieces of the Cyber Resilience Act that need to complete the total package. The people working on compliance also will be the people who are going to encounter issues and who spot things that are difficult or impossible or inefficient, and then they will be able to provide input into these legislative instruments. And in that sense, the people who are working on compliance are also working on the legislation itself. And then the people working on the legislation, they need to talk to the compliance people and help the compliance people understand the legislation. So people working on legislation are working on compliance, and people working on compliance are working on legislation. And so this is important because the regulatory work is sometimes split into these two silos, and in some companies it's different people or different departments. In certain organizations, it's even the US entity does one part and the European entity does another part, and so this will cause some need for coordination or possibly reorganization of some entities to make compliance easier. So while we're doing all that work, the requirements of the Cyber Resilience Act are not actually applicable at the moment in terms of people being fined for non-compliance. And so the Cyber Resilience Act entered into force in 2024, but the fines only become applicable in 2027. And so that's our timeline now for trying to get further improvements and trying to work on our own compliance procedures. So the Cyber Resilience Act took people a little bit by surprise, and not that it was the first time that we had to deal with legislation, but it was the first time we had to deal with market regulation, and it was also probably the most invasive type of regulation that we've had to deal with. And so in the past, we worked on, I guess, copyright was the largest legal topic we worked on. And we interacted with that by ignoring most modern aspects of copyright law and developing licenses that required only what was in the Berne Convention, the basic copyright requirements that are respected or used by most or all of the world. And so in that sense, we didn't have to change everything to comply with new copyright regulations. There were occasional exceptions, but they were narrow rather than horizontal. So the Cyber Resilience Act made us realize, or made everyone realize, some people knew it already, but that we can't choose whether or not to apply this law. Some people saw the Cyber Resilience Act and said, well, that doesn't apply to us because our licenses specifically disclaim any warranty, and they say that the software is provided as is. And that was that's true about our licenses, but the licenses don't trump the law. And so the licenses can only disclaim liability to the extent that the law permits them to disclaim liability. So we have this Cyber Resilience Act that we have to comply with, and we have to work within the timeline that is imposed by the Cyber Resilience Act. So when you're forced to do something, it's usually the natural reaction is that you wish you was more of a choice than being forced. But that shouldn't shadow our judgment of whether or not the Cyber Resilience Act is actually a good thing. Uh, I'm not going to say in a blanket statement that it is good or is not good, but there are ways that we can implement it that will help our ecosystem in some ways, or there are ways that we could begrudgingly do the bare minimum, and it would turn into compliance work with very little actual benefit for our ecosystem. So I think it's best to approach this with a positive attitude and to think about uh, the objectives of the Cyber Resilience Act being to increase cybersecurity. And well, what if we try and do that and do it in the Cyber Resilience Act compliant way, so that then we get compliance and we get the security that is of benefit to our ecosystem. So the good news with regard to the European Commission and the European Parliament and the European Council is that they have shown a willingness to engage with us. And so, in particular with the European Commission, for example, we had the Open Source Congress last month in Brussels. It was a day that was organized around 4 panels. We had 4 European Commission speakers, 1 on each panel, plus a 5th one gave a presentation. So they come to our events, they participate in these discussions. I also speak with them regularly. I had a meeting with them last week. I have another meeting today. On Thursday, we have a code and compliance meeting in Brussels, which is another CRA compliance event. And again, somebody from the European Commission will join and participate in the workshop that is the largest session of that day. So there is also willingness on their side. So this is all very, very positive. So up until now, we've been talking about the Cyber Resilience Act, but there is obviously a lot more than just the Cyber Resilience Act. We have, at the same time, the implementation of the Digital Markets Act, which is a fairly big one, but I didn't work on this one, so I can't answer any details about how that's going. We have the Product Liability Directive, which was quite a scary piece of legislation because it looked like it was going to create no fault liability for any damage caused by software. That's what it looked like it was going to do. But we managed to get a lot of clarifications into that, and the situation for free and open source software is actually not changed all that much by this piece of legislation. However, this particular piece of legislation is not a regulation. It doesn't apply to the European Union. It's a directive. So it tells member states how they have to change their national law to comply. And so we do still have to try and look at how the member states are implementing this product liability directive and ensure that they don't go beyond what's required or accidentally create some obligations that are very difficult for us to comply with. And the 4th one that is in the implementation phase is the AI Act. There are, of course, others. There's the Digital Services Act, there is the Interoperable Europe Act, and there are many more, but I'm just going to highlight these 4. So one part of implementing all these pieces of legislation is that there are standards to be drafted. And so the CRA is the biggest one because we have 44 obligations that are being dealt with in standardization processes. However, we also have standards being developed for different parts of the AI Act, the Data Act, and the Interoperable Europe Act. I have not been in contact with the people who are working on implementing working on the standards for those 3 pieces of legislation. And so this is another issue that I'll get to a little later, which is the difficulty in participating in all these pieces of legislation that have been created recently. A second, and there's 4 different categories of policy work that I'm going to present briefly. The second category then is input for upcoming proposals. And so the European Commission has said that they will have a new piece of legislation called the Cloud and AI Development Act. So this is more cloud than AI, but it's going to be a big one, and so we'll have to work with the European Commission to make sure that this is done in a way that is useful for our ecosystem. There is the EU's long-term budget, the MFF, the multi-annual financial framework. And so this is where we would hope to be able to get financing for the long-term maintenance or the sustainable maintenance of our software. And to do that, we have to make sure that we have to suggest ways that this aligns with the obligations or the objectives of the European Union. And then a third upcoming proposal is the position of the European Parliament on technological sovereignty. And so this term, and there are other similar terms that are basically synonyms. There's digital sovereignty and there's digital strategic autonomy and a few other terms. But the general idea is that the EU institutions have realized now that we have these deep dependencies and this type of lock-in, which is very difficult to get out of. And getting out of is not going to be free or easy. And so there are people in the EU institutions who are starting to think about how to develop a strategy for getting Europe out of this this lock-in situation, and so how to ensure that we have technological sovereignty and the ability to control our software. So that would mean the ability to audit software, to provide our own security updates if necessary, so that nobody outside of Europe can say that security updates will be cut off, and then to be able to store our data in Europe, for example. And this is something that is not absolutely tied to dealing with European companies, but in most cases it should be possible to choose a European company if the situation requires it. The third category of legislation that we're currently working on is for revision of existing directives. So the previous one was about new pieces of legislation. This is about revising existing legislation. So there are three public procurement directives which exist in the European Union, and they are currently being revised. So this would be an opportunity for us to try and change the rules of public procurement to allow for public bodies to take into account things like the transparency or the ability to audit or the ability to hire any company to make changes. And so all the benefits that you get from free and open source software, we'd like those to be eligible to be part of the criteria when a public body is going to procure some software. If we can do this, the benefits will be that first off, we get funding for our projects, which is always healthy, and second off, more generally, it should stabilize the ecosystem by both increasing the amount of funding, but also diversifying the sources of funding. And so this would be one big opportunity. A second piece of legislation that is up for review is the CHIPS Act. This is only 3 years old, but this is where we have to look at open hardware and where the European Union could improve the legal framework of open hardware and possibly how, review how this is important to the overall objectives of the European Union. The third one is standardization, and so this is called Regulation 1025, and this is an important one, but it will not be discussed much in the media because it's not very. It sounds like boring framework regulation, and it is, but it's also very consequential. So the 1025 will decide how the European Union interacts with the standard setting organizations, and so this is very important because that decides whether free and open source companies and entities and individuals will be included in the procedure, and whether the actual procedures of those organizations, if they will be compatible with the way of working of people from the free and open source ecosystem. The fourth one is similarly important for fundamental reasons, but will not get much attention in the media. And this is the new legislative framework. And so this is the document which defines certain key terms and procedures for product regulation. And so it's things like placing on the market and uh, deciding when something happens in a commercial context. And these things are always quite difficult for software. They seem to have been first developed with hardware in mind, and then maybe extended to software with a view of software as something that's created by a single company and then released. And the modern context is so different to that, with multiple companies commercializing the same piece of code, and then users being able to become commercializers as well. And so uh, this is something that we need to review the NLF so that it can take those into account. And the last one is important is the last one that I think is important to mention here is the Cybersecurity Act. And so this is one that I haven't seen the details of yet, but I've heard it's going to change the way the European Union thinks about supply chains. And that, once again, is crucial, because the supply chains in free and open source software are so different and so much more dynamic and so much more, uh, in ways, complex than the supply chains for physical products and for proprietary software. Uh, at the same time, I don't think the difference between proprietary software and free and open source software is getting smaller as time goes by, because increasingly proprietary software is actually based on a lot of modules that are free and open source software, and then a proprietary layer on top. And so the we actually may have shared interest in that one. So then some issues that are raised by all this new work that we're having to do is something that I've started to call participation fatigue. And that's the word I thought of. Actually, I'm looking to change that term, because it's a little bit negative. The issue is that when the European Union was drafting all these pieces of legislation, in particular in 2022, 2023, we kept on saying that they were difficult for us to implement because we weren't consulted during the drafting of these pieces of legislation. And so we pushed and pushed to get consulted on anything that's going to affect our ecosystem. And the European Commission was actually quite open, and actually has created a lot of avenues for us to participate in the various bodies that are working on these pieces of legislation. And so in in the AI Act, uh, there's a body, I think there was an AI expert group, and I think there might be an advisory council. And in the Interoperable Europe Act, there's a community and a council. And in the Cyber Resilience Act, there's an expert group. And then there's various procedures being drafted to to take input for the other pieces of post legislative instruments that I mentioned earlier. And so we've actually been given a lot of opportunities now to participate in all these pieces of legislative text. And now we're hitting the problem that we have a certain number of people, and we have to pick and choose. We can't actually participate in all the different working groups that we may want to. And so that's something that uh, we we can't really fix by talking to the European Commission, because we requested all this, all these avenues. Now we may ask them for some understanding, and to acknowledge that if we don't participate in something, it's not because of lack of interest. So we will stay in dialogue with them about this, but at the same time, the real solution is that in our ecosystem, we have to increase the volume of our policy work, and we have to ensure that the organization of that work is good, so that it avoids any kind of any duplicate work or any inefficiencies. So this is an extra then layer of work that we'll have to do to ensure that we have a well organized process. And the third issue that gets raised then is the role of foundations. And so this changes, because in the past, foundations have traditionally done a lot of the administrative work that projects would like to have done. And that could be in terms of holding the copyrights, or holding the trademarks, or processing donations. And a lot of this work was, uh, well, the appreciation for it was uh, not always all that strong, and sometimes, in particular, when you're telling projects that they have to do some extra administrative work, sometimes the appreciation is even negative. And so the work that has been historically done by the foundations, mostly on a volunteer basis, that work may dramatically increase. And so the the support that foundations, if the foundations are then to take on the increased administrative work, the amount of support the foundations get for this work may need to increase as well. And then this will then create follow-on questions such as if it all has to be financed, who's it get financed by, and does that increased finance create any other independent issues of its own? So that's in terms of those are the structural issues. Then in the execution, there are some things that we need to think about how to improve the way that we perform our work. One is triggered by an interesting comment by somebody from the public sector at a recent meeting, and it was that they said that open source is a black box, and it was a surprising statement when they said it at first, but the point they were making was that if the open source and free software ecosystem come to the European Commission with two contradictory or different proposals or requests, the European Commission and other EU institutions have absolutely no way to figure out which of these two proposals or requests is the right one to choose. So if, for example, if a business alliance comes with one set of requests and foundations come with different requests, then the European Commission can't decide that one of these entities is right and the other is wrong. For them, it's so complex and so detailed and so foreign that it's basically it's if you come with two proposals, then they're looking at a black box. They don't know what to do. So this is an important thing. So if we want to have our voice heard, we have to come to the European Commission with a single voice, which is something that is not always easy to organize in our ecosystem, because our ecosystem is a global, uh, sometimes informally organized ecosystem of a very diverse group of not just people, but categories of contributor. We have academic contributors, and we have very large corporations, and we have SMEs, and we have the hobby contributor, and then we have the contributor who works for a big company but is not paid directly for this work they are doing on this project. Maybe this is just part of how they get their other jobs done. And so we have all these very diverse categories, and but to be listened to by the European Commission, we're going to have to ensure that they get a single message. So that's something we have to figure out how to do. The uh, the third thing then is that we in the past we've often done policy work as something that some managers or developers or lawyers would see and spot that it needs work, and they would get involved. And the thing is, policy work is something like the procedures for a piece of legislation are written down, but the way that they play out in reality is quite different to how they seem when they're written down on paper. The dynamics of the different people involved shape what parts of the procedure are actually crucial, or which parts will get delayed, or what parts will be sacrificed for other parts. And so really to understand how policy work is done effectively, you really have to live through a cycle of legislation, from the initial proposal to the adoption, and then even through the implementation phase. And the problem is when we have people who who have a passionate interest in a piece of legislation, they may do this for a year or 2 years, but eventually they have to go back to their normal job. And when they do this, all the knowledge they accumulated goes back, or leaves the group that was working on policy. And so it's important for us to have high quality policy work. We have to make sure that we have people who are permanent staff working on policy, and usually this means full time as well. That's policy work is very much about the context and about the relationships, and it's very difficult to do it on a part time basis. It's much more natural to do it as a full time activity. The last thing I would say about improving is one of the differences between policy people and, for example, lawyers or developers or managers is the way of communicating with the public institutions. And so when we look at our software and we see that governments uh, would benefit from having all these, the four freedoms, uh, if we go to the governments and say you should support this software financially because it benefits, because it's what you need, then we're basically giving them an extra piece of work to do. We're telling them that they should do more for us. So what we have to do is we have to look at what they're already trying to do and what their objectives are. And for example, if they're interested in digital sovereignty or transparency or strategic autonomy, then we have to show them that we already have a lot of what they need in order to achieve their goals. And so we should work together on getting these, on achieving these goals. And so it's a different way of working with the Commission, with the Parliament. It's not standing on the outside telling them what they need to do. We have to go in and we have to do part of the work as well. And we have to work together and figure out what the common goals are between us and the people we're talking to. So we do this when we're working on specific pieces of legislation, but there's also a certain amount of background education that we need to work on a constant basis. And so this is partly because of the turnover within any of the public institutions. The people who are working on legislation, they might not understand the development model or the business model of free and open source software, and then we have to educate them. But then 3 years later, they might move on to a different department, or they might move into the private sector, and so there's a constant turnover of people in the public sector, and so all the education work we do, it never gets to a finished state. In particular, some of the pieces of educational work that we have to focus on are the idea that uh, while governments now are starting to understand that sovereignty and digital sovereignty and strategic autonomy are important, we have to make sure they don't go down an isolationist route with this objective. And by that I mean we could have software that serves Europe by, for example, developing a lot of software in Europe. However, if this brings us to the situation where we have a European web browser, a European web server, a European file server, this is going to end up with a lot of duplicate effort, and duplicate effort is usually lower quality effort. It would also mean probably ignoring a lot of the free and open source software that already exists, because in general, free and open source software projects after a certain size are developed by an international community. So we have to ensure that the people in the public sector understand that to work on sovereignty, it's important to find a way to do this in a way that allows us to continue working with other parts of the world. And if that means that we have to have procedures in between where software comes from and who uses it, well then that maybe that's just how we do it. That's we have to develop these procedures and these ways of verifying. The second thing that we need to work on for background education is to ensure they understand, the governments here is what I'm talking about, ensure that governments understand that they benefit more from free and open source software as is than they would by trying to monetize it. And this is something that I haven't seen firsthand myself, but I've heard other people discussing it, and I've heard that some governments are looking at free and open source software and looking at the success and the businesses that are building up around it, and they're saying, well, if there's a lot of money circulating, then maybe we should be getting a percentage of that, or maybe the companies in our country should be getting a certain percentage of that. And if if they come with that mindset, then the the solution that they might think is obvious would be to create some kind of tariff or fee that has to be paid, or to use existing laws such as patent law to try and find a way to ensure that local companies who may own patents can then extract revenue from the free and open source software which is being commercialized in that member state. So, of course, this you know this means that our business and development models would no longer work as at least not as well as they do at the moment. And so it's important that we get the governments to understand that whatever amount of money they think they could get uh, by charging a fee for this the circulation of this software, they're already getting a larger benefit, and they would be harming the benefit they're already getting if they try and introduce this monetary system. Uh, a third thing that we have to ensure the understanding of is the idea that free and open source software is a standardized system, and it was created in 1983, and it has stood the test of time. We've been using this general framework, and we've been building on top of it for 42 years. And the you know, and anyone who tries to create a cut down version of it is very likely to not succeed. The idea, if you see a complex system that has been in place for a long time and is functioning, the chance that you can make a fundamental change to that system and have it continue functioning is very low. And so, for example, sometimes government entities in Europe, they have the idea of, well, what if we had free software, but it can only be free in Europe? And well, this then cuts out the whole international collaboration, which is part of the value of the software. And that's why this idea has not been proven or not been found to work in any other part of the world. So this is another piece of education that we have to work on. And then the last one that I'd mention is one that sometimes we skip because it's actually we think it's too obvious. And so this is in a recent conversation with the Commission about a piece of legislation they're reviewing. We asked what type of topics they would like to hear about, and they gave us some technical details, very interesting. And then they said, oh, and we'd like to hear about what the economic value of free software is for the European Union. And we thought that we were only going to be discussing the technical details of a piece of legislation, and so we hadn't thought about maybe the people who are receiving the input, the people on the other end of this questionnaire, maybe they don't know the things that we find self-evident. And so sometimes we also have to have a clear explanation of things that we think are basic. The one of the last, I can't see how many slides I have left. I think I'm getting near to the end though. So then, so far I've been talking about the European Union. The next thing I think we'll have to talk about is the global context. And I think this is a little bit slow this year in many ways. I think the change of administration in the US has caused governments around the world to slow down their own plans because everyone's taking a little bit of a wait and see, and trying to decide if a new way of negotiating has to be found. But there will eventually be probably other countries and other parts of the world that create other pieces of legislation with a similar objective to the Cyber Resilience Act or the AI Act or the other piece of legislation that I mentioned earlier. And so if they create a piece of legislation with similar objectives but completely different obligations, then we're going to have a very messy situation of having two systems now to comply with. And then when a third region and a fourth and a fifth create their own obligations, we end up with 10 different systems to comply with. And we will have companies and projects saying that they can't comply with everything, and then they'll pick and choose. They'll choose, okay, I'm going to focus on Europe and Asia, or I'm going to focus on the US and Asia. And the problem then is, if you try to combine two projects, if one of them has documentation for the US and Asia, and the other has documentation for Europe and Asia, then you will find the only place that you can distribute and commercialize the combined project would be Asia, because you don't have the documentation for the US for half and for the EU for half. So this would be the worst case scenario. And then, but there are two ways that we can avoid this situation. One would be to ask other parts of the world to have legislation that is compatible with the Cyber Resilience Act. Now, this is complicated, although solution number two is also complicated, so don't disregard this one. So this is complicated because, in general, other governments don't want to copy a foreign government. In general, governments want to look what's best for their country, and then create the best system they can. However, in this situation, the best system for their country is probably going to be something that is compatible with the rest of the world. And so we will have to try and talk to the other parts of the world and recommend that they do something similar to the Cyber Resilience Act. But at the same time, knowing that the Cyber Resilience Act, because it was the first piece of legislation, it didn't have any other pieces of legislation to learn from. And so there may be others who have a better idea. And so we may have to ask governments to choose between, do you want to use a better idea that's incompatible, or do you want to use something that is as good as the CRA and is compatible? And so one way that we might be able to discuss this would be an approach called take the good, leave the bad. And so in that way, we could recommend that other countries adopt a subset of what's in the Cyber Resilience Act, and then they would have hopefully they would be they would this pick and choose approach would be sufficiently customizable to their situation, but it would also be, because it's a subset, it would be completely compatible, and people could do compliance once and they could distribute and commercialize everywhere. So this is one approach, is if other parts of the world had a subset of the CRA or the AI Act or other piece of legislation. The second thing is that there is a mechanism in the Cyber Resilience Act called mutual recognition agreements. And so these are quite difficult because it's a very high level of staff in the European Commission that would work on this, on the drafting of this. But it is possible for the European Union to have an agreement with other countries about recognizing their compliance work as fulfilling the CRA obligations. And then in return, that country would recognize CRA obligations as fulfilling their local regulation. So these are two ways that we can hopefully get the global situation to not get out of control and to remain as simple as possible and as efficient as possible. And so part of this is, for the Cyber Resilience Act, if we want other parts of the world to do something compatible, we should probably try to ensure that the Cyber Resilience Act is somewhat or completely a success in the European Union. Because if we approach the compliance with enthusiasm, and we make sure we do a really good job, and we make sure that our compliance work not only ticks the boxes, but also really does improve cybersecurity, then it'll make it a lot easier to go to other parts of the world and say, this is a reasonable piece of legislation. If you adopt this, you will also have certain improvements in cybersecurity. And so this type of enthusiastic compliance could be part of how we keep the global situation reasonable. Then I think there's a duplicate slide, and actually maybe the remaining slides are duplicate slides. Indeed. So with that, I'll finish up there. I didn't have a clock. I hope I didn't go too much over time. But if anyone has questions, I will stay to answer them if there's time. Otherwise, I will hand back to Vladimir.
Thank you so much, Kieran. So we don't have Maybe I put my video on again. We don't have that much time left, but I would probably use the time to see if there's any questions for you, because I don't think it's worth it now to jump into the local context. But I at least found it really fascinating what you mentioned about this attempt to capture some of the value that's created by open source in the respective jurisdictions. It seems kind of like an open source tariff of sort, where you try to really keep that in the local context. I'm not sure that would work in the way the regulators think it will work, but it's still a fascinating idea. And I think Martin also mentioned something in that regard in the chat.
Just to comment, yes, I think it's a in a way fascinating idea, but really bad idea, because it goes against in a way the value creation principle that we have. We create enormous value in the next chains, and we should, in order to maximize that value, we should in a way enable as much proper FOSS usage as possible, and then putting a tariff there would just actually be a destructor there for the next added value that we create. Yes.
Indeed, and this is one of those things. It's obvious to us, but we have to explain it, and we have to have justifications, and we have to have, we have to be able to explain it in a way that they want to understand it. And so the challenge is, how do we make this understandable, and how do we show that it aligns with the objectives of these governments?
Like Photoshop. I mean, you can have mask, you can have whatnot.
Okay, then let's wrap up with this final question from Martin about the cadence. I mean, I guess you mean how frequent we would want to meet, or I would give it here as a discussion point. But for me, maybe something for starters, something like maybe once every 2 months. Let's say I'm not exactly sure for the frequency of the other groups how frequent they meet at the moment. But until we get this more ramped up, what do the others think about once every 2 months?
It depends a bit on the what's the thought agenda. Now we had like an interesting presentation from CRA giving like a high level thinking there, but it would be in a way valuable to look at what each of us is doing in their own countries, and what can we learn from each other. So that might also be like one agenda point.
Yes. So how would you like we do it this way? Maybe we can make another call in a few weeks, and we can focus. So I already prepared some points for Bulgaria. Maybe Ivo can also help me out to try to improve this. And maybe you, Martin, can give some overview for Finland, and we can use the first call for those two countries. What do you think about that?
Yeah, and let's just ask people who are now in the call that if somebody would be willing to share something what's happening in their country.
Perhaps not my country, but we will be around in some events in the next weeks. So I could at least offer to share the news from the open source events that we're seeing. And maybe also what we're currently doing is planning the outlook for 2026. So I think that might be interesting then, especially if we go to a 2-month cadence. I would say ideally still before Christmas, right? So that we can also use that as a end of year outlook for 2026 as one agenda point. If you want, just an offer.
And just a follow-up thought to that, that perhaps we just set up a date for early Christmas. Perhaps it's close enough for the 2-month cadence, and then all of the people who are now present, because we had a reasonable attendance, can get that date, even though we are a few minutes over time already.
Yeah, let's try to do that. Sounds good. Okay, then I guess I should close the call. So thank you everyone for attending. Thank you so much, Kieran, for joining us and for giving this overview. It was really helpful. And yeah, let's then I will write a note on the mailing list for the next call, and see you then. All right, bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye. Have a good one.